Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to discuss some pretty big news in Minneapolis Public Schools. After 5 years, Superintendent Ed Graff will be leaving this district on June 30th. And so this was just announced yesterday. His contract's going to run out and he will no longer be the superintendent after June 30th. So Heather, this is huge news. I'm interested. What were your initial reactions when you heard this?
Well, we know that there's been a lot of tension about whether or not people wanted to give Superintendent Graff another contract. We know that the vote to renew his contract was really tight, right? And so we've heard some board members say that they didn't want to do a superintendent search with a split board. The board split differently than the CDD vote. Like this has been something where there's been activists in the school board room asking for the board to either not give him a contract or to give him a one-year contract with metrics. And so, it's always surprising when a thing actually happens, but also if you look back at the last few months, it's probably something that we should have been thinking was going to happen, right?
Yeah, we mentioned in some of our initial social media posts, but I also think, one of the things that is hard is we've since the beginning of the strike on March 8th, we've had three major announcements of leadership changes in Minneapolis Public Schools. A school board member who served as an officer, Josh Pauley, resigned. Senior officer of human resources, Maggie Sullivan's resigned, and now Superintendent Graff announces that he's no longer coming back. So I think what more than anything, it just feels like a very unstable Minneapolis Public Schools right now, especially at the leadership level. But I think what is also important, I think we need to set some context for what happened during Superintendent Graff's tenure. And so he became superintendent, I believe, in 2017. And since then, right, he walked into a district that was not in a great place financially, and we know is still not in a great place financially. But it's a different type of place, right? I think when Superintendent Graff came in, the finances were in real disarray. We were regularly having audits that were saying we were out of compliance in several areas. We didn't have any type of savings for any type of emergency. And so now we're in a more structurally sort of healthy place in terms of our finances are a little bit more intact. But
we're passing audits.
We're passing audits, which is significant, and I know is something that was a talking point throughout the strike, which is can we trust the finance department? Yes, we can, because Senior Officer Giop, under Superintendent Graff's leadership, has made sure that our finances are right, accurate, and also very transparent on the website. And so that's a significant shift from where Superintendent Graff picked up this district. Also, Superintendent Graff walked into the district with not really a strategic plan in place, right? And so that was pretty significant in the sense of the district just didn't have an overall direction that it was going in. There were some board members that were attached to the old strategic plan, Acceleration 2020. Some board members that were had given up on it entirely. And then Superintendent Graff has also named through a survey, a majority of the staff did not even know what Acceleration 2020 was. And so, that was another part of this district that he inherited. And then on top of that, a board that was pretty divided. Not that has also changed, but a board that was divided when he walked in as well. And so we know about Superintendent Graff, he really is the type of superintendent that wants board direction, right? Who wants to serve at the pleasure of the board and, wants to do whatever essentially the board asks him to do. And finally, and again, not that this has changed under his leadership, but Superintendent Graff was inheriting a district that had some of the worst racial disparities in education outcomes in the nation, right? And so these were the things that Superintendent Graff was asked to address. Was walking into and said here is your district, now figure it out. And that was those challenges were enough. But then Heather, like, let's talk about what's happened since then, since he became superintendent.
I mean, we've had a pandemic, right? And I do think, we did pivot really quickly to a one-to-one school district. My kids immediately were able to get laptops, and we were creative, and we had I think we hosted the first virtual graduation in the country, right?
Yeah, I think that's what his email named, at least. So
yeah. And then we lived through the murder of George Floyd and the city and the uprising that followed, and students watched blocks, burn down. And I remember doing distance learning during that time, and some of the frustrations of some of the assignments that were given. And that was a very real and hard time. And then, the pandemic didn't end, right? It continued to go on, and we went to school, and then we had hybrid, and then we had some days in school and some days not. I mean, this is a district that has been forced into a lot of challenges that a system I always talk about this with MPS. This is not a nimble system, right? We are so big. We can't necessarily like pick up this and put, people here and there. It's not nimble. And we have had to be incredibly nimble over the last few years. And then we just went through the first teacher strike in over 50 years. And so this is a superintendent who inherited really big problems, and then got to town, and then, here's some more really big, unheard of problems.
Yeah. And, and amidst all that, and trying to address some of those things, the CDD also happened. The CDD was designed and created under his tenure, or through his tenure, right? And so the implementation of the CDD, students switching schools, lots of frustration, lots of confusion, but also hopefully an opportunity that makes this city a little bit more equitable. And so, lots of things were happening through his tenure. And then also quietly, they did pass another strategic plan. They passed their first strategic plan just before the strike started. And so there are things that definitely happened, and some of them Superintendent Graff tried to address. Some of the issues that he inherited, tried to address. And then a lot of his time was spent putting out fires that were outside of his control, certainly. And so, I think those are some of the things that I'll remember most about Superintendent Graff's tenure, which is just like, I don't think anybody would have wanted to trade to be in his position, even though other cities across the country also went through a pandemic, right? No other city also went through the uprising in the same ways that we did.
That's right.
No other cities were just dealing with all of the, I guess, the historical layers of institutional racism. And I'm not saying that Superintendent Graff handled all of these situations well. All I'm saying is I know that I would not have wanted to be in the position to make the decisions and lead a school district through all of this in the ways that he was forced to. And I think the biggest thing is that's not what he asked for walking into it either. And so now here we are on the other side of, all of this, including the strike. That was very, tense for him and for the city. And here we are. And so, I think we just we've just been through more than anything. I think when I think about my initial takeaways around the announcement that Superintendent Graff made, I just think about his tenure just serves as a reminder of what we have been through as a city over the last 5 years. So yeah, that's a lot. And I think what's also important to remember is that Superintendent Graff definitely wasn't perfect, right? I think a lot of folks had a lot of concerns about his top-down style of leadership. He, in those moments where I think people wanted him to be more visible as a leader through the pandemic, through the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings as a result, I think people just wanted him to be more present, to be there, to let us know as a city that like he cares, he understands, he's empathizing, he's hurting in the same ways we are as a city. And that wasn't his style of leadership. And I think that definitely rubbed people the wrong way. And yeah, I think that it was definitely a missed opportunity when with a city that was hurting and a district that desperately needed to build trust with its residents. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my experience has been that, and I mean, one of the amazing things that we get to do is build relationships and talk to other organizations and community leaders that care deeply about the students that we care about, right? And so when you talk to other organizations, other spiritual leaders, other community leaders in our district, especially communities and orgs of color, they all have a sense of feeling very much like Superintendent Graff wasn't interested in their opinion, wasn't interested in listening to what they had to say, wasn't interested in a relationship with them. And I've heard that feedback from many, many communities and places. And I think when I think about what came out from St. Paul the night before their potential strike, which was like, here's our plan, ready to go, right? And all the community members we've had these ongoing relationships with that are ready to step in along with this hard thing with us. And then I looked at our plan, which was like, no school, good luck. That you could really see how Minneapolis public schools in many ways, I mean, some of that's the fault of the elected folks in the city, that they put our public school system on its own island. And some of that was I think, a leadership style of Superintendent Graff that I'll never agree with. I think you just always need more collaboration, and more folks to help you and support you and to say hard things to you.
Yeah. This is your thought as we were prepping for this, and I just wanted to hear your reflection on it. But you said that Superintendent Graff was not willing to put himself in spaces of discomfort, but was very willing to allow students, especially students of color, to be uncomfortable. And yeah, I think that's a really profound statement and clearly a critique of Superintendent Graff and his leadership. But I think it's a fair critique. And I think the school board meeting on Tuesday is a really good example of that, right? The students came into the room and they said bullshit. And that was apparently the line that made Superintendent Graff uncomfortable, and he left. And, I think while I ultimately agree with the tentative agreement and the return to work plan in terms of the changes to the calendar and kind of the position that the district's in right now, I do think that those students had very valid points, and there was no clear communication to the students or families around why this is happening and how are you going to address some of the real questions around jobs, around apprenticeships, internships, things that students were going to be missing, especially in high school. I didn't think there was an appropriate response to that, but instead of responding to those questions, his thin line was around profanity, and he walked out of the room and never returned. And I stayed until the room cleared out basically, and he never returned. His car was gone by the time I was walking out in the parking lot. And not to say that this is the reason why he should be gone or he should be resigning or anything like that. But it is to say, I think it is emblematic of that point. And so anyways, I asked you a question and I just started rambling. If you wanted to talk a little bit more about that thought, I just thought it was profound and I wanted to hear you kind of talk through it a little bit.
You and I have been involved in some actions with students and where they felt like teachers used overtly racist language. Right. We know there was a situation at Northeast Middle School where a teacher said very egregious things. We know that there was a situation at Washburn with the teacher. He didn't say it at Washburn, right? But yeah. And so I've watched Superintendent Graff in person from that same chair say, we have to understand more and people need a chance to change and people come to me and they want teachers fired and we need to understand the full story. And from that very same chair, he said to a group of students, a curse word is the end of my ability to listen to you. And I think that's some real tone policing, that like his threshold for teachers racially harming students that he was charged to teach and take care of was like, we got to know all the facts. But students who feel some kind of way about being told what's going to happen to them instead of being asked about what's going to happen to them,
without an opportunity to comment also at that meeting, by the way.
Without an opportunity to comment, right. And I mean, and I understand that ultimately he and the board felt like there was no choice for them, right? And that they couldn't give the students a choice. But we do know, but I do know that he is capable of giving people second, third, fourth, and 15th chances, because all of those teachers that I named are still happily employed by Minneapolis public schools. And they've done real racial harm to communities.
Right. So I think, to this point around like his unwillingness to feel discomfort ultimately has been an impediment to some of the growth in Minneapolis public schools. Being able to hear the criticisms around the lack of an academic plan, his invisibility during the uprisings, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, his unwillingness to say that it was murder, by the way. Like, I think those are, yeah. And so I think those are things that do feel emblematic of also parts of his leadership style that, was less willing to take chances, was less willing to put himself out there and lead and, let us know what is happening. And that, I think, ultimately also ended up making the strike go longer, right? Like, it took a long time for Minneapolis public schools to come out and tell their side of the story around the finances and understanding of finances. And once that started to be told a little bit more, we saw some of the asks from the teachers continue to like decrease, but it just didn't need to take as long. And so I just think that, it's been a long 5 years. It's been a hard tenure to be superintendent in Minneapolis public schools. I will state that, and I stand by that statement 100%. And also, I think there were things that Superintendent Graff could have done better in those moments. You can always look back. I'm sure he looks back at all of these moments and says, I could have done things differently. I could have done things better. So this isn't necessarily meant to be an indictment of it. But I do think as we start to look forward to, all right, what does this district need now? I think it is not necessarily the antithesis of Superintendent Graff, right? Like, I don't think we can just look at this as like, we just need the opposite person of Superintendent Graff, because that is a frame that will get us into another extreme that, will not lead to better results for students. We need to do an analysis of what this city needs right now, what this district needs right now, and who can best fit those needs. And so, I'm throwing this question back at you without a ramble. In your estimation, what are like the top two needs for you around what this district needs right now out of a leader?
Yeah, so communication and community. Those are the two words that immediately come to mind, right? I'm still getting a robocall every Friday, letting me know that transportation is changing for my students. My kids have been school walkers all year. And yet, there are things, so I think we need to be communicated with in an honest way. I think a lot of the way that Superintendent Graff communicated was a little bit more defensive, like until everything was zipped up, we couldn't know anything. And I understand that, right? But what you risk along the way is the opportunity to build relationship and to watch a group of people hear you say, I'm sorry, I was trying my best, that wasn't quite right. So I would be looking for a superintendent that can be very communicative, that feels like it can trust the community with holding some of the tensions instead of just waiting until things are decided for us. I'd like, and then I think someone that's willing to build community. I think this is a superintendent who's going to come into a district. It's going to have a lot of people who are going to need to say and vent a lot of harm and anger that person didn't cause. Not even that, I'm not even saying Superintendent Graff caused all of it, but we are hurting. And I think it's going to be a person who's going to be willing to help us all hold the hurts and express it. And it needs to start with students. We need a superintendent who's in buildings with students.
Yeah. When I reflect on this question, I'm honestly really concerned about the state of the district. It's really important to us as a city, to me as a person, that we have a healthy, strong Minneapolis public schools, and we are just not there right now. And I think that, first of all, at the timing of his departure, of Superintendent Graff's departure, if the board selects an interim, they need to fully empower this interim to do the work that is necessary, because another lost year for students, another lost year in our financial situation, it's just untenable. A lost year for staff, support, maintenance, like it's just untenable. Because like the strike was and is a culmination of deferred decisions for the last 10 years.
That's right.
It's a culmination of the exposed disparities around what's happening in our buildings for our staff of color, for our students of color every single day. Right. And so I think that it's going to be really important, first of all, for the board, whoever, if there's an interim named, for the board to say, like, we need you to like come in and do this as if you're staying, because we just need somebody to make the decisions and to run and to operate this district in a way that like we just have to we need, right? It can't just be a lame duck. It can't just be somebody who's just filling the seat. So that's the first thing I think that's important. But in terms of somebody who's going to take the full-time role of superintendent, we need somebody who's going to take who has the ability to do the hard thing and have the tough conversations, willing to take that criticism, take all the hits that come with it, and come back the next day and be willing to do it again. That is a person that probably gets burned out in 3 years. And also that is the person that we need, because we have some really hard conversations ahead of us.
We do.
We have, again, the conversations around potential school closures has come up a couple of times now. We know with just the ESSER money that is going to run out, that was, there's a high likelihood of, massive layoffs in the next couple of years. The districts already projected that in their pro forma, right? Like, so there are real issues ahead of us that this superintendent is going to need to lead through, and not just continue to kick the can down the road. Because again, that is what got us to the point of a strike. We just didn't have enough money to pay everybody. And so, because we don't have as many students. So we need somebody who can have those conversations and handle making hard decisions. Also, we just desperately need somebody who is going to be unapologetic around getting students of color and disinvested communities the resources necessary to improve the academic outcomes in our city.
That's right.
And again, in a city with finite resources, that is going to cause pain, right? That is going to cause pain across the district in lots of different ways. And so we're gonna need somebody who can confidently say, this is what it's going to take to make sure that students of color get the type of education that they deserve. And that we have a responsibility to give them, because we have been failing at our responsibility to give students of color the type of education that they need in order to be successful for decades. And so those are the two things that I'm going to be looking for and saying, like, how do you handle these hard decisions? Do you have the backbone? Do you have the resilience, the persistence to have those hard conversations and to be able to communicate them, like you said, but also move forward, right? And say, like, this is what we need to do as a district. It doesn't need to be top down. It can be collaborative, but it also has to be some of the really tough decisions that nobody wants to make. because it costs you jobs, it costs you elections, it costs you so much. But our students have been wearing the expense of that
That's right.
all along. So those are
Well,
the
and
things we're looking ahead.
one of my favorite quotes from you ever is that equity is not a hug. It's not a feeling, right? We often think that equity is something that we just get to say, where privileged folks don't have to give up anything. And that's not the reality. The MPS is a finite system with finite resources. And if we are going to be equitable and give students of color what they are owed, we will have to make cuts from places that are not used to having cuts. And I know, and we are going to need a superintendent who's going to say that, who's going to follow through with it unapologetically and prioritize the needs of students and families of color. Like that's what our city's desperate for that. And we're going to need somebody who's going to be able to talk about a real plan for learning loss, because the MCAs are coming up right after our kids have been out of school for 14 days. And that's another conversation that we'll be watching and talking about. But we have to continue to talk about academics and the academic debt owed students of color.
Yeah, I think that, this superintendent cannot shy away from the academic conversation. We had another criticism of Superintendent Graff, did not have an academic leader in position for like 3 of his years as superintendent, right? Like that is a problem. And for, especially for a district that did not have strong academics to begin with. And so I think that, we just have a real opportunity here, but we're also in a very vulnerable state. And we kind of need this person to do it all and challenge the status quo. And constantly challenge the status quo, challenge white supremacy. And that's the superintendent that we're going to need to be making tough decisions, because honestly, like we have nowhere else to take from at this point. So anyways, that big news, chaotic moment, hard, difficult moment in MPS right now, but, stay engaged, stay involved, check out what the meeting minutes are from school board meetings. Check out those documents. Like we're not getting information from anywhere other than those places, and consistently watching. And so if you can't do that, continue to follow us. We're hoping to continue to provide valuable and accurate information. And thank you for listening.
Bye.